soon. Will you agree to your thing and everything? Oh. Afternoon. I call to order this hearing of the Rules and Administration Committee on Oversight of the U.S. Capitol Police following the January 6th attack on the Capitol. I would like to thank Ranking Member Blunt and our colleagues, and of course our witness, the Inspector General for the Capitol Police, Mr. Michael Bolton. Thank you for being here. And we appreciate the recommendations and the work that you've done in this area as well. We are here today just over a week after releasing our bipartisan joint report with the Homeland Security Committee that focuses on the security, planning, and response failures related to the violent and unprecedented insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. We all remember the haunting words of an officer on the radio that day asking, "Does anyone have a plan? Does anyone have a plan?" The answer, sadly, that day was no. Our report lays out not only key findings, but important recommendations with needed changes to prevent anything similar from happening again and to ensure that in the future there is a plan. I continue to support a January 6 independent 9/11 style commission to look at the larger causes of the insurrection as well as a rise of domestic extremism. These issues greatly contributed and caused what happened at the Capitol that day. But the focus of this committee, combined with the Homeland Security Committee, which actually allowed us to extend our jurisdiction and look at more things even outside of the Capitol Police, because we did it with Homeland Security, which included looking at the role of the Defense Department decisions as well as the FBI and Homeland Security and the like. Our focus was on what happened that day and what we can do to make sure it doesn't happen again. We believe that we should not wait to implement changes that can be made immediately. And today's hearing on oversight of Capitol Police practices and procedures is an important step as we look at reforms that should be put in place without delay. Toward that end, we are glad that Mr. Bolton is here to discuss his work and perspective on the major issues facing the department. Since January 6, Mr. Bolton has issued 4 flash reports looking into the breakdowns and failures in the lead up to and on that day. These Inspector General reports, which covered topics including intelligence, operational planning, the Civil Disturbance Unit, and threat assessment, have expanded our understanding of what happened that day. These reports also identify changes that are needed with the practices and procedures of Capitol Police leadership, especially as the confidence of rank and file officers has been seriously undermined. Many of Mr. Bolton's recommendations identify reforms, and we also put those reforms together as part of our joint report. Based on what we have found, I want to focus today on the major changes facing the department as well as the changes that are needed both to restore trust and ensure the security of the Capitol complex. First are the intelligence failures, which greatly contributed to the breakdowns we saw on January 6th and left frontline officers unprepared for what they faced that day. We know that the 3 intelligence-related units within the Capitol Police knew about social media posts calling for violence at the Capitol, but that the full scope of these warnings never made it to the Capitol Police leadership, rank-and-file officers, or law enforcement partners. There were also conflicting reports on the threats. One Capitol Police intelligence assessment on January 3rd warned that the Capitol could be a target, but a January 6th daily intelligence report called the likelihood of violence, quote, remote, unquote, to, quote, improbable, unquote. Second, we know that there was a major issue with the lack of equipment. 75% of the officers on duty that day were forced to defend the Capitol in their regular uniforms. Some of the equipment issued that day was old or had degraded due to improper storage, as was the case with some of the protective shields distributed that had been stored at the wrong temperature, making them shatter on impact. Just imagine being a police officer, you're given a shield, and it shatters on impact. In another instance, officers could not access the gear that they needed because it was locked on a bus. Third, we know that there was an issue with training, that less than 10% of the officers responding that day didn't have advanced civil disturbance training, and many officers hadn't received any civil disturbance training since their initial recruit officer class training. And fourth, we know that there was no comprehensive department-wide operational plan from leadership in advance of January 6th, which resulted in confusion and a lack of communication that placed frontline officers in peril. We know that incident commanders who could have provided better communication to officers ended up being unavailable as they fought with rioters themselves because there had not been better preparation. And we know that there was no plan to deploy the National Guard if things escalated to a point where they were needed. And there was a delay in getting the required approval from members of the Capitol Police Board to request immediate National Guard support, an issue that I'm introducing legislation to address with Ranking Member Blunt, and we will be doing that very soon. These failures resulted in an unnecessary delay in the arrival of National Guard troops to assist in defending the Capitol from an armed insurrection. The Guard should have been, of course, called in before this started as the intelligence was gathered, and there should have been a plan to use the Guard, but even that day, they could have been called in sooner. There is a lot to get through today, and Mr. Bolton, I look forward to hearing your testimony. And with that, I want to recognize Ranking Member Blunt for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thanks for holding this hearing. It's the third hearing of our Committee of Rules and Administration. Two of them we did, as the Chairwoman mentioned, with the Homeland Security Committee, and that did allow us to talk to more people. But of course, today we're here with one of our principal responsibilities, and that's the responsibility of working with and helping and assisting those people who protect us every day, the Capitol Police. Last week, our colleagues at Homeland Security and Government Affairs, along with this committee, issued a comprehensive bipartisan report of security failures on January 6th and made a series of detailed recommendations, I think thoughtful recommendations, directed at the Capitol Police, the Capitol Police Board, both the House and Senate Sergeants at Arms, the federal intelligence agencies, the Department of Defense, and local law enforcement. Today, we want to focus our efforts where your efforts have been on the Capitol Police. Our bipartisan report made it clear that the Capitol Police officers were the true heroes that day, defending the Capitol with courage and honor. Their inspiring efforts, along with the immediate assistance of the Metropolitan D.C. Police and the assistance that followed later from other forces in the area as they could get here, made an incredible difference. But their inspiring efforts, while they thwarted the rioters' goal and ensured that Congress could fulfill its constitutional obligation, were in so many ways done at great risk to themselves beyond what we think would be necessary with a force that's better equipped, that's better trained, that's better prepared to defend the Capitol. We owe that to the officers that defended us that day. The breach of the Capitol must never be repeated, and in all cases, we want our officers to be better prepared, better equipped. To date, the Inspector General's issued, as Senator Klobuchar pointed out, 4 flash reports, and while the reports were done quickly, they were done, in my view, with great thoroughness and 65 significant separate recommendations. Both our committee and the Homeland Security Committee, in the report we issued last week, commented favorably on those recommendations in our joint report. I understand that you'll have more reports in the future. We look forward to reviewing those new recommendations with you as well. Today, we'll hear more about the Inspector General's current recommendations to improve the operational readiness of the Capitol Police, the recommendations in the bipartisan Joint Committee report, including the Inspector General's recommendations, can be and should be implemented quickly. Many of these recommendations do not require congressional approval or Capitol Police Board approval, nor do they require, in many cases, additional appropriations. They just require quick action now that we know the problems that were inherent in the system as it related to preparation and equipment and training. This also marks the first time that the Capitol Police Inspector General has testified before the Rules Committee in a public hearing, and we look forward to hearing further from the Inspector General and the Capitol Police in future oversight hearings. As I've mentioned before, Chairwoman Klobuchar and I have a long history of working together to ensure not only the smooth daily operations of the Capitol, but on a number of other legislative areas outside this committee where we've been able to work together. We will continue to do that on this important topic. As she just mentioned, we'll be introducing legislation in the very near future to provide the Chief of the Capitol Police with additional authority to seek external assistance in the event of an emergency. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Bolton today and working with his office as the investigation into the events surrounding January 6th continues. And so thank you, Chairwoman Klobuchar, for holding this hearing and what you've done so far to move this information quickly, to make it available to people, and to try to find quick answers to the problems that we know we need to solve.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Blunt. I would now like to introduce our witness for today's hearing, Michael A. Bolton, the Inspector General for the United States Capitol Police. Mr. Bolton has served in the Capitol Police Office of Inspector General, also known as the OIG, for nearly 15 years, and he was appointed as Inspector General on January 20th, 2019. Mr. Bolton previously served as the Acting Inspector General beginning in March of 2018, and before that, he served as the department's first Assistant Inspector General for Investigations beginning in August 2006. In that capacity, he played an active role in developing policies and procedures for the Office of Professional Responsibility and the Capitol Police Board. Prior to joining the OIG, Mr. Bolton served for 4 years as a special agent in charge of the Office of Investigations for the U.S. Department of Treasury. There, he worked on cases of procurement fraud and on complex criminal, administrative, and civil investigations. Before his time at Treasury, Mr. Bolton served for 21 years with the U.S. Secret Service, where he held numerous roles, including as a member of the Presidential Protection Division. Mr. Bolton holds a degree in criminal justice from the University of Maryland. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Bolton. And if you would please stand and raise your right hand so I could administer the oath. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before the committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, sir. Thank you. You may be seated. You are now recognized for your testimony for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before you, the Committee of Senate Rules and Administration, to discuss our review of events in regards to the department's operation, programs, and policies that were in effect during January 6, 2021. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the committee for holding this hearing. As I have stated previously in my other hearings, but I do believe that this bears repeating, I am addressing not only the committee members exercising their constitutional role of oversight, but I'm testifying to witnesses, as well as survivors, who were affected by the events of January 6. On January 6, a physical security breach in the United States Capitol building occurred during a joint session of Congress to certify the Electoral College vote. My goal is to provide each of you a better understanding on how the events of January 6 occurred in relation to the preparation and response of the department. Other factors were involved, and other entities are reviewing those aspects outside of the Capitol Police Department. I will discuss the non-law enforcement sensitive findings detailed in my 4 flash reports. Any law enforcement sensitive questions can be answered in a closed-door setting. Shortly after the January 6th events, I notified the department, board, and the committees that my office would be suspending all future projects listed in our annual plan for 2021 to allow my entire staff to conduct a full review of these events. In order to accomplish this goal, both audits and investigations will combine their collective talents to achieve a complete review of the department. In addition to my staff, I brought on 2 additional contractors with expertise and knowledge to assist my office, a retired Deputy Assistant Director of the United States Secret Service and a retired Senior Special Agent Chief of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Our reports are not designed nor intended to cast blame on any one individual or group. These reports are intended to be an independent, objective review of the department's programs and operations to better protect the Capitol complex, members, staff, visitors, and the rank and file officers who have shown their commitment and bravery each day by keeping us all safe. A collective effort must be undertaken to ensure that each and every officer, when their shift is over, gets to go home to their families, as well as the safety of those who work and visit the first branch of government. Our objective for this review is to determine if the department established adequate measures to ensuring safety and security of the members of Congress, their staff, and the Capitol complex. Establish adequate internal controls and processes that complied with department policies and procedures and complied with the applicable laws and regulations. The scope included reviewing the controls, processes, and operations surrounding the security measures prior to the planned demonstrations and the response to the takeover of the Capitol building. Our recommendations are made by conducting interviews, document reviews, the combined knowledge and expertise of my staff, and following best practices throughout the federal government of those relevant agencies with similar functions of the department. We are currently providing the department, board, and the committees a series of flash reports every 30 days. We're reviewing each element within the department, noting any areas for improvement. We are providing any corresponding recommendations to compel the department to move towards a protective agency as opposed to a police agency. At the time of this hearing, my office has completed 4 flash reports. The first report was a review of the operational planning for January 6, including a review of intelligence gathering processes required for operational plan that related to January 6. Our second flash report focused on Civil Disturbance Unit and Intelligence Division as a whole. Our third flash report focused on threat assessment and counter-surveillance. And finally, our fourth flash report focused on the Containment and Emergency Response Team and First Responders Unit. We anticipate our comprehensive review will extend for the remainder of FY 2021. Currently, my office is reviewing Command and Coordination Bureau, and we anticipate issuing that report by the end of July. As of today, we have made 65 recommendations detailing areas for improvement. Along with your report, with additional recommendations and findings that I completely concur with, we have provided the department with a roadmap to achieve the ultimate goal of providing security to the Capitol complex for a safe and open environment for members, staff, and visitors, and the rank and file officers. As our work continues, my office sees continuing areas in our findings that need to be addressed. Those areas are intelligence, training to include leadership training, operational planning, and a cultural change. In regards to a cultural change, we see the department needs to move away from the thought process as a traditional police department and move to the posture as a protective agency. Whereas a protective agency is postured to being proactive in preventing events such as January 6. In conclusion, the department is comprised of extraordinary men and women who are dedicated to protecting our democracy, putting their own lives in harm's way in order for Congress to exercise their constitutional duties in a safe and open manner. Thank you for the opportunity to prepare before you today. I'll be very happy to answer any questions the committee may have at this time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Inspector General. When supporters of President Trump stormed the Capitol after his speech and after months of his false claims about the outcome of the election, we saw the results of that. And we issued a joint report that focused on the issue of what went wrong at the Capitol leading into and during that day. Do you want to comment on our report and what you thought of the report?
I believe that your report, which of course I've read, it was spot on. It hit the mark of exactly what failed that day, the deficiencies within the department, and highlighted, and it was very useful for my office as well to review that report, and we appreciate that report as well. But it certainly was a report that hit the mark. I completely concur with all your recommendations and findings.
Well, thank you. And one reform that both your report and our joint report called for is consolidating Capitol Police intelligence operations into a single bureau, as opposed to the 3 offices that currently exist. Can you briefly explain the problem with the current way that intelligence is handled? I noticed one of the things was that you found is that public tips and other information received by Capitol Police Intelligence weren't properly reviewed and acted on.
Thank you. You're exactly right, ma'am. The problem when you have the different elements not coming on, it's almost what they refer to as stovepiping. You have different silos. That information is not being funneled up to the individuals, either to the command staff or all the way down to the officers, where that information can be acted upon or analyzed in formulating either an operational plan or a different posture that you may have, or call in additional resources. You need to have, as your report noted, that if you have a bureau, the way it is right now, it's not a standalone bureau, and you have these other elements in there, you're going to have a concerted effort in acquiring and disseminating and analyzing intelligence information in a bureau level setting.
And there wasn't, that aside as a major problem, there wasn't any kind of a department-wide plan for even where people would be located that day, even though they had officers there. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. The officers are different units, even though they were mentioned in the Civil Disturbance Unit operational plan, as it were. Those units weren't even consulted or didn't even have knowledge that they were included in this plan.
And we recommend establishing the Civil Disturbance Unit as a formal, permanent component of the Capitol Police, making sure that those officers are trained and that they have the right equipment. Do you believe that those officers involved in protecting the Capitol when there is potential civil disturbance should be trained on a regular basis?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. If you have a standalone unit, the CDU, as opposed to as now as an ad hoc, you're not getting the training, the equipment, you're not developing that camaraderie that you would if they were a standalone unit where they start working together and you start knowing the individuals that you're working with, and you're being able to, it's like a team, a sports team. Mm-hmm. The more that you're there together and the more they practice, the better they're going to perform on game day.
And there's been one of our findings, as you know, was that 75% of the officers were forced to defend the Capitol in their regular uniforms. Some were locked outside of a bus. The bus contained their gear and they couldn't access it. There's also been public reporting of officers' gear being stolen by supporters of President Trump, by rioters. Is there something that you found as well? How would the equipment inventory and storage procedure in your most recent report help to prevent this decaying of the equipment as well as the potential stealing of the equipment?
In regards to maintaining the equipment, one of our recommendations was tasking property to start doing an inventory, continuous inventory to update and to properly storage that equipment. And you're correct that through our first responders unit, we had 12 helmets and 12 ballistic vests stolen when they were basically had to retreat. They were pre-positioned. We need to make sure when we're doing the planning stages, if we're going to pre-position, that equipment is secured so that it won't fall into the hands of the very people we're trying to stop from taking over or causing trouble.
During our first joint hearing on January 6th, we heard how while the House and Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, the former House and Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, were concerned with the safety of their members, The former chief of police was desperately trying to call them to get approval to deploy the National Guard. Of course, it should have been done ahead of time. A plan should have been in place. But even at that moment, he was forced to call them to try to find them while they were trying to guard the chamber. Do you agree that the structure of the Capitol Police Board impacted the ability of the chief to request assistance on January 6th that day?
That's a difficult one for me to speak to, considering, one, I answer to the board. They are,
Oh, I see.
They are my bosses.
Oh, okay.
So there are those who are looking into it. Yesterday's hearing that I attended with the GAO has produced a report in 2017 outlining changes for within the board.
Right. And do you think that we should consider reforms to the board?
Everything should be considered.
All right. The Capitol Police Board is now conducting a search for the next Capitol Police Chief who will face the major tasks of responding to breakdowns that occurred on January 6th and rebuilding trust in departmental leadership among officers. Based on your work so far, what do you think should be the top priorities for finding the next Capitol Police Chief?
I'm not involved in the selection of the chief, obviously, so I'll speak on a high level. It should be an individual that not only is schooled in within law enforcement, but a high-level executive with the education and the skill set, also as a protective person with the knowledge of protective agencies, force protection, if you want to call it. Someone that with that kind of level that is also very aware and understanding how important training really is, and not to give lip service to training, and to coordinate and making sure that whatever training, because training dollars obviously are very rare, are very slim, they're difficult to fund in a sense. But if you have to make sure the training that you're doing is linked to your mission, making sure that training dollars that are very rare, that we can actually get to that training and expend the funds appropriately.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to, we have many members here, so I will put some questions on the record on your recent findings regarding the department using a contractor that displayed images with known connections to white supremacist groups. And if I have a moment, either I or someone else will ask those questions as well. With that, I will turn it over to Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, Mr. Bolton, thank you for being here. By my count, which may not be, you may not have counted these this way, but by my count, around 50, my count says 50 of the 65 recommendations that you made can be implemented by the department without any legislative changes or additional appropriations. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes, sir. That does sound about right, because a lot of my recommendations are to update or create policies and procedures or to reinforce certain policies and procedures. Those certainly do not require legislative fix nor approval by the board.
I think the remaining 15 focus on implementing proper training, acquiring necessary equipment, bolstering the department's intelligence unit. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
And there may be some cost to that, but even in those areas, not this hearing about cost, but those areas the cost is a cost that clearly is manageable and easily accessible, I believe, for the Capitol Police. What steps has the department taken to implement the 50 recommendations that don't require legislative action or further appropriation?
I just had a conversation with a member of the Capitol Police Board. They have formed a what they call a board working group that's going to be focusing on not only my recommendations, but also General Andre's recommendations and your report, the Senate's report recommendations. They will be meeting. They think it's just, they've had 2 meetings so far. My discussion with the board member was that I will be included, not so much in the meeting, but the after action to provide me with an update of where the department is heading to and kind of a time frame for where I would be able to start seeing some of the closures, the recommendations, and where they're at. So the board has instituted a working group. It is up and running now as we speak. So that is one of the, and as well as we try to reach out to the department periodically to see where they're at with their recommendations.
Good. On that issue, do you feel like you've had the cooperation from the department, including the current leadership, that you needed for your flash reports?
Yes, sir, absolutely. We have received full cooperation, and they've made themselves available whenever we requested an interview and/or documents.
And you've looked at our report. I appreciate you saying that you completely concur with the recommendations and findings. But let me ask you about a couple of things just specifically to be sure we're concurring in the same area. One of our recommendations is to update the department's incident command system in order to designate who the incident commanders would be ahead of a large event, ensure better communication during the event, frontline and better communication during the event with frontline officers, and to require senior leaders to take over communication responsibilities if needed. Do you agree with that recommendation?
Yes, sir. In fact, we are in the midst of conducting our other flash report, the Command and Coordination Bureau, and I suspect that that will probably also be one of our recommendations as well.
And you believe the department could implement this now if they wanted to through your oversight group that's looking at it?
Yes, sir.
So would I be right in assuming that now can the department can they move forward with any of these 50 recommendations, or do you think that's now has to go through the group that the police board has put together?
It's not so much that it has to go through the board for that process, that working group. That working group, I think, is to assist the department in moving forward and whatever, if there are recommendations that they may need assistance from the committees, that the board can assist them in that. But I also believe that it's the board is to kind of keep them on track, keep them moving forward. It was just recently last week that the department requested, I think, closure of 6 of our recommendations, about 6 recommendations for our second flash report. We did close 2 on relating to the first flash report. Those had to deal with basically updating the policies and procedures. So they are moving forward with our recommendations, and I believe that this working group will assist them in keeping that momentum going.
Well, I think momentum is important here, and it's been our view, both Senator Klobuchar's and mine, that so many of these things we now clearly have a sense of what we ought to do, and now we ought to be sure that we move forward as quickly as we can to make the changes. Do you believe that better command planning and communication on January 6th would have helped prevent the breach of the Capitol?
Certainly, the better planning, along with there's also a lot of elements, but training, proper equipment, but certainly the planning would have put the officers in a better position to succeed.
One of the recommendations of the joint report is for the Capitol Police to conduct joint training exercises with federal, state, and local partners on the command and control process during an emergency. Do you agree with that recommendation?
Yes, sir. When you are able to conduct joint exercises, joint training, not only with our federal partners, but one of our recommendations is that we need to be doing joint exercises within our own department, with our own different elements. That way everybody knows what they're doing, and we're taking a concerted, coordinated effort into whatever the situation or event calls for us to take action.
And on the idea of an event, one of the recommendations of the joint report is that the department-wide operational plan be in place for special events, that would be required. You agree with that?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Is important, do you think that a plan like that would have helped prevent the breach of the Capitol?
Yes, sir. I firmly believe having a coordinated effort and plan would help and put the officers in a better position.
My understanding that following January 6th, the Command and Coordination Bureau will be overseeing operational planning for special events. Have you seen any new directives from this bureau that would require department-wide operational plans for large events?
I don't believe I've seen that. I may be incorrect on the last. I'm trying to remember the most recent request for closure of recommendations. I can get back with you, sir, to make sure that I'm correct on that. But I do know that they have started since the events creating an operational plan more robust or thorough than the previous one, and so there seems to be that they have moved towards that area.
My last question this round would be, one of our recommendations was that a civil disturbance unit be established as a permanent component and have dedicated officers as part of that unit. Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Blunt. Next up, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Inspector General, for being here. And I want to begin by thanking the Capitol Police for everything they do every day for us, for their bravery on January the 6th. And I think we certainly want them to know that I think we all deeply respect them and are very appreciative of their efforts. My first question is, you mentioned that you want to go from, you think the Capitol Police should go from being a police entity, police agency, to a protective agency. Where would the then policing aspect of their jobs now, where would that go? DC Metropolitan Police, or how do you envision that kind of coordination?
Some of that, it's almost also a posture that you're going, when I say move to a protective agency, it's not that every officer then would go into a suit and tie thing, but their focus would be less on minor crimes like around the Union Union Station, those type of areas, or simple traffic violations. But your training is the important component of all this. When you start training individuals into a protective mode and thinking protection, much like with DPD or with the Secret Service, you're teaching your folks about protection and how to go about it. And like even with the Secret Service, you have uniform division who have police powers, but their focus is on protection, whether it be the foreign embassies or the White House with vice presidents. So it's also a mindset.
So you're not really envisioning a dual, two different agencies being here. You're just basically repositioning the way the force actually thinks about them. I mean, we call them the Capitol Police. So, maybe that would be a good place to start, maybe rebrand them, or at least through their training, certainly. You mentioned, and this has been mentioned in all the reports, that the training was not there, both on the how to handle the situation or a situation similar to that, but also training on weapons and the use of certain types of weapons. I saw the CERT team did not, I think it was only 10% were up to date on their training for certain types of weapons. What was the reason for that they were not trained?
It maybe it's a tenfold or a severalfold, but as far as training is near and dear to my heart, to speak, because I came also from the Office of Training as a firearms instructor and as a counter-assault team. So I understand the importance of training. There's no excuse for not getting your training in. Even with the pandemic and COVID, they train out at Fort Meade. There's plenty of open air, open space, and wide open that you can spread out and still get your requals in. To me, the biggest failure is that because we have allowed certain elements within the Capitol Police to be autonomous. They conduct their own training.
Okay.
That's the issue. Whereas if you have a training services bureau, and let's call it an office of training, that is fully incorporated, they handle all the training. They conduct it. They make sure you get the training. They hold your officials accountable. Your people didn't get training, guess what? We're sending a letter to the chief, and they can no longer work until they get recalled or what have you.
Sounds a little bit like our cybersecurity training. You make it mandatory, and if you don't follow through with it, there are consequences. Let me ask you this. Were there, and I don't know the answer to this question, were there any canines in and around? I know the canines are treated to detect weapons or maybe even substances. I actually, when I was the appropriator for the Capitol Police, went out to their canine training center. It's kind of an area of interest for me. I know there's a shortage of fully trained canines in all law enforcement, whether it's at the airport or wherever it might be. What was the posture of those officers? And are those dogs trained in a protective way rather than a more anticipating, if you understand what I'm saying, more aggressive posture?
Yeah. Well, first off, we haven't looked specifically at canine. Our plan for our continuing reviews in August, we will be looking at canine and HMRT specifically. But as we have done with because we're also reaching out to individual officers for this report that we're doing now, the command and control, to get their officers and what commands are given. Some of the things that we have received and spoken to us is that K-9 at that point, they were tasked with basically supplementing CDU. Their dogs were then placed into kennels, into our department kennels. They were kenneled, and those officers as handlers were put on the front line.
Oh, okay.
So the problem when you do that is when you put a dog in a kennel, it's stressful for the dog, and dogs can only work. These are dogs like any other canine dogs, not us specifically. They do require a certain amount of downtime, and because they're in a kennel, they're not getting that. So then, when it was called upon for them to go ahead and sweep the Capitol once the insurrectionists were removed, you're wondering, you have to be mindful that those dogs are tired now. And you're tasking them to do very high-level work. Our dogs basically are not attack dogs. They're not crowd-controlled dogs. They are sniffers, they would say, type dogs.
Would that be a recommendation to amplify the force to get more crowd-controlled dogs?
I would venture probably not crowd-controlled dogs. Most police departments have moved away from that concept of crowd-controlled dogs. There are some that still employ that, but then again, that is something that needs to be really considered.
Yeah. Okay, and my last question is: you've made a lot of recommendations, and the report that came from the committee, a lot of recommendations. You're following up on this. You said you're going to be on this for the next till the end of the year. Is part of that following up on the recommendations to see in what stage they might be, or if they're being implemented by the Capitol Police?
Basically, right now, our plan is that once we've completed our reviews of the different elements within the department, we're going to produce a report on all the recommendations, and to give a report to the committees and to the board, the status of all the recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much, Senator Capito. Senator Ossoff, he's on remotely.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your continued leadership, and thanks to your staff, as well as the ranking member staff for their work preparing this report. Mr. Bolton, thank you for joining us today. On February 22nd, during this committee's first hearing on the events of January 6th, I asked a simple question of the panel: who's in charge? Who is ultimately responsible for the security of the United States Capitol complex? Nearly 4 months and many studies and ongoing investigations later, I want to ask the same question of you. Who today, which individual, is ultimately responsible for the security of the United States Capitol?
That's a difficult question to answer in a sense that, yes, you have a chief of police who runs the day-to-day operations for the Capitol Police. But then you have a Capitol Police Board, an entity, that also basically has oversight of the Capitol Police to chief. They have the authority to hire or terminate the chief. So that would be a difficult question, but if you try to pin it down the best, you would say probably the Capitol Police Board has probably the ultimate authority.
Mr. Bolton, would you agree with me that when a question like who's in charge, which individual is accountable, is difficult to answer? That suggests, especially when the stakes are so high, this is a national security issue, the need for reform to establish clear lines of accountability, clear chain of command, and one individual who is ultimately accountable for the security of the U.S. Capitol?
I would agree with you, sir, that if it takes us that hard to distinguish who is actually in charge, then it certainly raises issues and questions.
And has there not been any capacity for the board and those who are currently entrusted with and empowered to secure the U.S. Capitol to streamline and make clear who's in charge? Does that require statute? Does that require action by Congress? What could the United States Capitol Police, the sergeants at arms, and the board do now to clarify which individual is in charge? Because I have to say, it is not reassuring to hear that there remains this basic ambiguity about responsibility, command, and accountability.
Well, sir, I think that the best individuals to ask that question would actually be the board as opposed to myself.
Okay, Mr. Bolton, we will put that in writing to the board immediately. I want to ask you about cybersecurity, and I know that this is not principally the responsibility of United States Capitol Police, but would nevertheless appreciate your view on the matter. The Senate Sergeant at Arms recently said that what keeps her up at night is actually not the threat of another violent, riotous invasion of the U.S. Capitol, but instead a cyber attack on the Capitol or on congressional information technology. Maintaining physical security over computers and other devices is an essential aspect of cybersecurity. I want to ask you if there is a plan, to your knowledge, to handle the extensive fallout that would result if congressional networks were compromised, and who, to your knowledge, is ultimately accountable for the cybersecurity of the United States Capitol. And I ask that question in the same spirit. Basic principle of management. If no one is in charge, then no one is in charge and no one can be held accountable. To your knowledge at this moment, with which individual rests responsibility for cybersecurity in the United States Congress?
Oh, sir, I believe that if you're looking at with the cybersecurity, the Senate Sergeant of Arms would have overall security for cybersecurity for the Senate. The House Sergeant of Arms would have it for the House, obviously, and Architect of the Capitol would be for the Architect of the Capitol for that entity. So those would, but there is no one singular individual overall for the Capitol complex.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Do you believe it would be appropriate to consolidate the disparate Capitol Police units responsible for intelligence gathering and analysis into a single bureau led by a civilian director of intelligence to increase the focus of Capitol Police intelligence gathering and analysis, improve the timely sharing of relevant intelligence, and improve coordination within the agency and its law enforcement partners?
Yes, sir. I believe that would be the most efficient way of going about the gathering and dissemination of intelligence.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. And a final question with my remaining time, if you'll indulge me, Madam Chair. Under existing authorities, the Capitol Police Chief lacks unilateral authority to even request assistance from the National Guard and must first obtain an emergency declaration from the Capitol Police Board. Do you agree with this committee's report in its conclusion that the Capitol Police Chief's lack of such authority to request National Guard assistance unilaterally hindered his ability to respond quickly during the attack on January 6th?
Certainly, sir. I think the results of what occurred on January 6th bear that out to be correct.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Ossoff. Next up, I believe, is Senator Hyde Smith, and the first one to arrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Klobuchar and Ranking Member Blunt, for today's hearing, and I certainly commend both of you on such a wonderful example of bipartisanship working together, and along with your counterparts on the Senate Homeland Security and the Governmental Affairs Committee to complete the investigative report that was released. You know, ensuring our Capitol Police have the intelligence and resources they need is very important to everyone sitting up here. And Mr. Bolton, your office has proposed numerous ways to improve the intelligence, training, equipment, and operations for our Capitol Police. All of those are very important. However, I'm concerned that without an adequate number of officers on the force, that all of this would be pointless. I continue to hear about the unprecedented resignations and retirements among the Capitol Police officers since the event on January the 6th. And I've also heard how the officers remaining on the force are working unsustainable schedules, including many overtime shifts, which you mentioned briefly in your testimony. How is your office now approaching recruitment, the retention issues to ensure that we can always have an adequate number of officers on the force?
Thank you, ma'am. Well, first, my office is not involved within the recruitment or retention of the officers. That's going to be handled by the departments. Their human resources would be handling that. The type of jobs that we have done is we have looked at how they constituted their recruitment office and how they're going about that. But as far as individually recruiting or being involved in it, that's not something within our role or responsibility and our purview of the actual physically going out there and recruiting. We'll look at, are they being effective in recruiting? And we would bump that out with either GAO best practices or other departments' best practices and how they go about recruiting, but not the actual recruitment of officers.
Do you have any recommendations on how we can improve the morale of the officers?
I think the best way you're going to improve the morale of the officers is give them good leadership that they can trust and provide them with a clear mission and train them to be able to accomplish that and give them the tools to do their job, and that will increase your morale.
And repeatedly throughout many of the flash reports that I had seen published by your office, you mentioned the difficulty in separating credible threats from violence, violence from the First Amendment protected activities. And walking this line is key to ensuring that we keep our Capitol complex safe and prevent unlawful activity, but also preserving the area to continue to serve as a public forum for the First Amendment activity. Are there best practices that you have identified for how to ensure First Amendment rights are protected while also taking seriously the potential intelligence about that violence and other unlawful activity?
Well, that's something you can circle back to having an intelligence agency or bureau with trained analysts to disseminate that information, provide it to the officers, your rank and file. One, that's going to give them the confidence of what they may be going to experience, be prepared for it, and understand the most important is the First Amendment rights for people to exercise those rights when they come up here to the people's house. The understanding is, I've heard many times, that they didn't receive any direct threat or substantiated threat for January 6th. If they're waiting for that mystical letter to show up on their desk saying you are going to have people who are going to grab your shields and break glass and storm the Capitol and such as that, you're never going to receive that. Intelligence is like a piece of puzzle, and you have to have the trained analysts to be able to put those pieces together to give the department a picture of what to expect and to be prepared for it. Also making sure to allow for First Amendment activity in a lawful manner.
And I'm quickly running out of time, but you also mentioned in your testimony the need for additional medical training for Capitol Police to ensure that the officers receive quick access to emergency care. One of the things that we have thought about is, have you considered whether there is any role here that should be played by the office of the attending physician or many of the nurses that we have stationed out through the office health units throughout the Capitol complex?
Maybe not in a direct manner, because again, you're talking civilians and placing them in case of harm's way, but having your officers and they can coordinate that kind of training with the office of physician and the nurses and a type of training. Back in my day, we called it 5-minute medicine. Every agent was provided training, what we call 5-minute medicine, in case to basically to stabilize an individual, whether it be a sucking chest wound, broken bones, compound fracture, that we would be able to at least get them stabilized in order until proper medical care came in there. So if every officer had at least that basic medical training that they can assist, whether it be civilians, innocent individuals, or their own officers, or even members, to be able to provide them with that immediate medical care for them.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bolton, thank you for your participation today. Now, in your testimony, you describe a need to change the culture of the Capitol Police from that of a police force to that of a protective agency. First, I guess a two-part question. First, in practice, what does it mean to reshape the Capitol Police into a protective agency? What would the practical and operational effects of that be, number one? Number two, how long do you think such a culture shift would take to implement? I mean, beyond just changing the policies, right, the words on paper and procedures on paper, what needs to be done in terms of training and tactics and ethos to operationalize such a change?
Thank you, sir. To best answer your question, one, in the thought process of a protective agency. A protective agency is geared towards proactive, that you're trying to anticipate as opposed to being reactive. Yes, that is not exactly a quick fix. Yeah, you can put certain things down as directives or SOPs. That's the part. The hard part, and the part that is actually going to require a lot of funds, is having a training services bureau, an officer training, that is geared now to teaching and also doing in-service training in that protective mode where you're changing basically the courses that you're teaching now, regular police type tactics or police procedures, that now you're shifting. So it is a fundamental shift, and it's not an easy shift because it's going to require for us, one, to have a larger footprint in Cheltenham, to utilize more of that space there, and it's quite a bit of an infrastructure we're going to be requesting, or they would have to request from appropriations, but as well as bringing in the subject matter experts, those who have been brought up into that type of environment, in that protective mode, and getting the department up to speed to where now they can do that training in there. So they're going to probably have to bring folks from the outside who are already trained in that skill set, get us that level, the subject matter experts.
Thank you. Next, I want to shift to the topic of white supremacy. It's a conversation we've had in Judiciary Committee with different nominees coming through for confirmation as it pertains to rooting out white supremacy, not just in federal departments and agencies, but in law enforcement agencies, frankly, throughout the country. But specific to this, and it's of top of mind for me, particularly because of, I'll be blunt about it, the relationship that the Trump administration and President Trump himself had with some of these fringe groups, which were in large part what led to January 6th. In the course of your investigation, you found that the Capitol Police's Containment Emergency Response Team, the CERT team, contracted with privately owned entities to train its personnel in firearm marksmanship and other tactics at facilities located outside the District of Columbia metropolitan area. One of the contractors used by the Capitol Police had, according to your report, quote, questionable content on their website, end quote. News reports have suggested that the questionable content includes symbols associated with the white supremacist movement. These reports are, of course, of serious concern. So beyond identifying the fact of the contract and the concerning website content of the contractor, have you undertaken any deeper study into why or how this particular contractor came to be selected? And more broadly, have you already or do you plan to undertake any study of whether the use of this contractor suggests a wider concern with white supremacist ideologies within the force?
At this time, sir, once we discovered that, we conveyed our concerns, as you mentioned, within what we call a management advisory report to the department, our concerns in recommending that they seriously consider not utilizing that particular company. We have not done any in-depth work on investigating that company. I did refer our information in my report over to the Department of Justice for action as they deem appropriate. It's more appropriate for them to look at it as opposed to that would be somewhat outside of my jurisdiction, unless we could show that there was a contract fraud that would keep it within my purview. But as investigating that kind of an entity, that's not within my jurisdiction, hence why I sent it over to the Department of Justice for the more appropriate entity to look at that.
And Madam Chair, just a follow-up question on this topic. So appreciate you engaging the Department of Justice for what they and only they can do. I would suggest that along with this culture shift that we're talking about, This is something that remains in your purview. And let me ask an additional specific question to help. Given the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and other non-contracted training facilities are nearby, is there any justification for Capitol Police relying on contractors to provide training to officers? And have you done a comprehensive review to determine if Capitol Police has entered into other similar contracts instead of relying on available federal resources to train other federal law enforcement officers?
There's really no reason for them not to use other federal agencies. My previous employer, Secret Service, when I was on the counter assault team, we would utilize, obviously, our own training facilities, which were a little bit more extended than what Capitol Police had, but we'd also use DOD. So we wouldn't have those kind of things, but it was approved training through the Office of Training to fit our skills and abilities and needs to complete our mission. We do plan on looking at, for FY 2020, I'm already trying to work on my annual plan for 2022. One of the things that we are going to look at, we're going to look at all outside contractors for the appropriateness and whether or not we would be able to use, leverage some federal agencies to assist us and save money, and that's kind of what our mandate is, the fraud, waste, and abuse, to weed out those.
Well, the fraud, waste, and abuse is in and of itself meritorious, but to the extent that it gives us a better ability to identify and root out dynamics such as white supremacy, I would argue, brings some urgency to it. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the first part of your answer to that final question sure sounded like there doesn't seem to be any reason or justification for using non-federal resources already available in officer training, and therefore the use of contractors to provide that training doesn't make sense.
That would be correct, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Padilla. Senator Hagedorn.
Thank you, Chair Klobuchar. Ranking Member Blunt, appreciate you having this hearing. Mr. Bolton, thank you for being here. And I want to also reiterate what my colleagues have said, how much we appreciate what the U.S. Capitol Police does for us every day to keep all of us safe and protected. I know they've been working long hours, and we very much appreciate their efforts. I'd like to start my question with you to highlight the critical role of local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies in the effort that took place all around the region coming together on January the 6th. I'd like to highlight the recent bipartisan report by this committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee, which notes that at 1:51 p.m. on January the 6th, the Capitol Police activated its mutual aid agreement with regional law enforcement agencies, and that led to a quick response by local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies who helped Capitol Police and Metro Police secure the Capitol building by 4:28 p.m., which fully an hour before the D.C. National Guard arrived. So, Mr. Bolton, I'd like to focus on how we can assure that Capitol Police officers have the leadership, the training, and the tools that they deserve. Your recent interview identified intelligence-related deficiencies in the department's organizational structure, the department's training, its professional standards, its internal controls, and the collection and dissemination of information, as well as a failure with intelligence evaluations in connection with January the 6th. These intelligence shortcomings were known before January 6th, in fact, identified in 2 previous IG reports. Similarly, the Bipartisan Rules and Homeland Security report found that, quote, important intelligence information received by internal U.S. Capitol Police components was not appropriately shared among USCP's distinct intelligence-related components. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Bolton, is it accurate that you found numerous Capitol Police intelligence-related shortcomings ahead of January 6th, at least one of which has been raised in previous IG reports?
That would be correct, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Leading up to January 6th, who was in the role of Assistant Chief of the Protective and Intelligence Operations, which oversees Capitol Police intelligence components?
That would be Acting Chief Pittman.
Thank you for putting it on the record. More general, the Bipartisan Rules and Homeland Security Committee found out that on January the 6th, Capitol Police leadership did not adequately utilize available intelligence. They didn't adequately plan operationally. They didn't provide protective equipment for officers. They didn't provide civil disturbance training to officers, nor did they communicate with officers during the violence. Mr. Bolton, your written testimony quoted a 2014 IG report stating that, quote, only when the right personnel for the job are on board and provided the right training, tools, structure, incentives, and responsibilities is operational success possible? So my next question, Mr. Bolton, do you believe that Capitol Police officers were given the training, the tools, the structure, the incentives, and the responsibilities they needed to succeed operationally on January the 6th?
No, sir, I do not believe that they were given those tools and the ability to be able to to be successful. Some of the officers that I have spoken to, just briefly, one made a comment to me, it's not so much that we had a fight with one hand behind our back, but at times they felt like both hands were tied behind their back.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Bolton, in reviewing your recommendations, I was struck that many of your recommendations focus on improving internal policies and practices, on improving training regimens, on improving organizational structures, and emergency preparedness. Is it your view that addressing these management issues that you've identified would go a long way toward remedying the issues that came up on January the 6th?
Yes, sir. If you establish repeatable business practices in doing what we need to do, complete our mission, you are going to be successful.
You concluded in your written testimony by stating that, quote, "It is our duty to honor those officers who have given their lives, but also ensuring the safety of all those working and visiting the Capitol complex by making hard changes within the department." I think that's very well said. And I agree that we owe it to our Capitol Police officers who put their lives on the line every day to make the changes necessary to protect them, to give them the equipment, the resources necessary for them to succeed in their job. Thank you, Mr. Bolton.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I just have a few additional questions. A vote has been called, but Senator Blunt and I just have a few additional questions. The Capitol Police currently has personnel who are integrated in intelligence task forces, including with the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies. Part of our report, as I mentioned earlier, was about recommending how the Capitol Police better coordinate with the FBI, Homeland Security, and other intelligence gathering agencies. Can you briefly explain, Mr. Bolton, the importance of these information sharing roles? And do you agree that the relationship between Capitol Police and federal intelligence agencies must be improved?
Thank you, ma'am. Absolutely. That is going to be your conduit in getting the intelligence. It's informing these relationships with these other agencies. It is important to actually establish a working relationship, meeting folks face-to-face, dealing with them on a daily basis, providing and sharing the information. That's how you're going to accomplish your goals, is by establishing these firm relationships and also understanding how you can learn from others. So it's not that everybody has the right answer. There's a lot of good answers out there. The department has been moving forward in strengthening those. Today's board meeting, which I attended, they were outlining several of the new initiatives that the Capitol Police are undertaking, and directly with involving into strengthening those relationships, getting out into the field offices to establishing also to help on threat assessment cases, as well as there will be bringing 8 new analysts on board here shortly.
Mm-hmm. That's good to know. When the 2 incident commanders ended up in the middle of the violent insurrection, which was precipitated by President Trump and his false claims, these commanders were unable to communicate. They were unable to communicate because they were actually on the front line fighting. Then no one from Capitol Police leadership stepped in and directed officers. And that was that haunting words of the officer, "Does anyone have a plan?" So our report recommended that the Capitol Police update its incident command system to establish communication priorities and contingency plans so officers aren't left listening to radio silence and pleas for help. Do you agree that the department's communication system should include backup plans so a senior officer is always available on the radio?
Absolutely, yes, ma'am. It should be one of those things where you plan for the worst, hope for the best.
Very good. Can you briefly elaborate on why some divisions, like the Containment and Emergency Response Team, have separate training programs, and why all Capitol Police training should be instead centralized under the Training Services Bureau?
As I outlined in my flash report, that is an issue that has long plagued the department in allowing these individual entities to become almost autonomous in the training. Hence why we have been vocal, very vocal about the need to centralize your training. We've brought up in other reports, K-9. Canines should not be conducting their own training. You need to have that separation of duties. Those are just best practices that any GAO report that if you pull up on training are going to tell you have a separation of duties. So these aren't something that's new that we're just thought this was a great idea. These are long-standing best practices. You've got to have a centralized training. They handle the training. And when you run into, it's the old thing of the tail wagging the dog. The department should establish what is the mission goals. We'll take CERT for instance. What is our mission goals? What skill sets do we need them to complete this goal? What are our expectations? What can and can't they do? They should formulate that, and which as one of our recommendations, do a study and formulate a detailed mission goals. Once you've done that, then you send it over to the Office of Training. They develop the training. They track the training. They bring in your subject matter experts. They conduct and monitor and track all the training. Okay. CERT is there to, then they have a clear understanding of what their mission is, and so does the department.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the department needs a standalone counterintelligence entity?
A counter-surveillance unit?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am. They certainly do. It would be very helpful. I know the Secret Service has that. They've stood that up a number of years ago, and that is quite helpful in conducting their day-to-day operations.
Last question. We've had, we know there's a lot of organizational changes that need to be made. We talked about the new police chief, legislation, those things. But there's also been, even beyond January 6th, an increasing number of threat assessment cases the Capitol Police have had to handle. The police department is tasked with tracking and investigating threats against members of Congress. Last month, the Capitol Police reported the threats against members are up 107% compared to this time last year. Does the Capitol Police have the resources and specialists needed to keep up with these serious threats?
They are ramping up in that very regards, like I just said, about the 8 new analysts to assist it. They will be standing up here shortly, if they haven't already, 2 field offices with a plan of 3 additional field offices throughout the country, basically regionalizing their functions out there to take certain locations within the country for those field officers to start handling some of that threat assessment, taking the load off here.
Okay. Very good. Senator Blunt.
General, your report indicated there were a few long-standing recommendations, namely realigning the containment emergency response team within the department's structure, requiring all officers to maintain a security clearance, and elevating all intelligence components of the department into an intelligence bureau. What do you think those weren't implemented?
There may be, I think some of that relates back to going back to the cultural change. Once again, we recommended, as you stated, that the CERT teams fall under Protective Services Bureau so they can better support the dignitary protective as well as other operations within the department. Again, I think that was a reluctance to change based on long-standing, long-term ways of doing business. So there's always going to be, people resist change.
Do you believe if these recommendations had been implemented before January 6th, it would have made a difference in how they responded?
That would be very difficult. Well, we don't have a crystal ball, but I would certainly say it would have put us in a better position to succeed at that day.
You said earlier that you report to the Police Bureau, though we may want you to testify before our committee more than we have in the past, since it's your first day here and we have some responsibilities with the Capitol Police. But when you reported to the police board, did you report to them that these recommendations weren't followed?
Well, they do receive copies of whenever we close on our recommendations, and they are briefed by the department on the status of their recommendations.
Are you aware that they've ever encouraged the police Capitol Police to move forward with your recommendations?
Sir, I'm not aware of those, but those discussions
All right.
could very well have happened, but I'm not aware of them.
On January 6th, the heavier, less than lethal weapons like sting balls were never used. Do you know who gave the order not to use those and why?
My understanding is it was a deputy chief who's no longer with the department, had those more heavier munitions stand down and not to be utilized. Some of those munitions, my understanding too is, and through our report, that they were also expired munitions, as well as individuals hadn't been fully trained and recertified to utilize those munitions.
Well, so training again would have made a difference in what could happen there.
Yes, sir.
I have some more questions for the record, but the only question I think I have today, in terms of rethinking what the Capitol Police, how they view themselves, whether it's a security unit or a protective unit, are there jobs in the Capitol Police now that are done by uniformed officers that don't need to be done by uniformed officers? If we set up this new intelligence unit, does everybody we might recruit for that unit, for instance, have to become a trained Capitol Police officer, or are they part of the Capitol Police who focuses specifically on intelligence? Have you given thought to that?
Well, certainly, I think right now most of your intelligence bureau, your analysts, excuse me, are non-sworn officers. They are civilian. So there's certainly a lot of those positions and also in other agencies are civilianized. They're not like with the service special agents. There certainly should be a study, at least a look or discussion of some of the duties that Capitol Police undertake now could be, let's say, just for as an instance, think of it as more of a security officer as opposed to a sworn officer.
Mm-hmm. Or a parking officer or
something
similar.
Yeah.
Would. Well, I think we ought to be thinking about that. We've just about worn out the Capitol Police force, and I think we talk about adding more to the force. Our first big challenge is to fill the jobs we have, and in every police force in America, that's a problem right now. So we've got to be thinking, I think, smarter of how we use the trained and sworn officers we have. Thank you, Chairman. I have other questions for the record, but none today.
Very good. Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bolton, welcome. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your examination of the issues behind what occurred on January 6th. The men and women of the Capitol Police and the other law enforcement officers who defended the Capitol, who defended members of Congress, were heroic. They are heroes every day, but that day in particular, they demonstrated extraordinary courage and valor, and they no doubt saved lives as a result of that bravery. Nonetheless, anytime there is a violent attack, a terrorist attack, it is important to engage in the careful retrospective of what steps can be taken, law enforcement steps, intelligence steps can be taken to prevent another incident from occurring. Looking at your flash reports, looking at the joint report that the Senate has put out, there have been a number of failings, law enforcement and intelligence failings that have been identified. In your judgment, what are the most significant intelligence failures that led to the failure to be adequately prepared for the violent attack on January 6th?
In regards to the Capitol Police, since it is within my jurisdiction, I would say not having the ability to analyze and then disseminate that information. That particular Norfolk memo or situational report never made it to the chief or to the upper level of the command. That can't happen. You've got to provide your commanders or your management teams with all the information. Nothing can be withheld from them because, again, as I talked about before, intelligence is like a puzzle. Now we just took one of the pieces and threw it away, and you can't complete the picture now.
So what were the impediments that prevented it from making it to the chief?
I think part of that is the basic structure that they had in place at that time, whereas the intelligence was not a standalone bureau. You didn't have the trained individuals there to analyze this information and to be able to, with clear policies on how to disseminate it up the chain of command.
So what changes should the Capitol Police make, or should Congress consider making in terms of how the Capitol Police is structured to prevent those intelligence failures in the future?
One of the biggest changes you can make is to make the current intelligence a standalone bureau. Elevate it to the level, beef it up, in other words, provide it with more assets, take some of the elements that's within the Capitol Police, within that division that's separate from them, bring them over and make it that it concerted, and where you have an individual that is schooled in the intelligence field from the very beginning of their career to right now. It's somebody that's well schooled and connected within the intelligence community.
In hindsight, on January 6th, what operational steps should the Capitol Police and other law enforcement have taken to prevent the violent terrorist attack from successfully breaching the Capitol? What could have been done differently to prevent what occurred?
I think the best way is to answer that, because hindsight, yes, that's what inspector generals do. We sit there and we're Monday morning quarterbacks. We're great at that. But I think just the overall, if you look at each one of our flash reports as well as the Senate's report, that's how we're going to achieve what we need to achieve. And not so much the hindsight, but here's what's before us, here's the roadmap, let's get to work and let's do it.
Well, but in terms of what we can learn from hindsight, would you say it is principally additional manpower, both police officers and National Guard forces, that would have made a difference on that day, or other steps that would have made a difference to prevent the attackers from successfully breaching the Capitol?
I think by having a very detailed plan, if you had the training, the equipment, the steps that you could have taken to put you in a better position to succeed at that day. They're there in front of us, that if we had those in place, we would have been in a better position to succeed.
So in terms of the significant failings, on the front end, you see the intelligence gathering and the failure for that intelligence to go up the chain to the decision makers. And then on the day of execution, the lack of an operational plan to deal with a violent terrorist attack of that magnitude. Is that right?
That'd be correct, sir.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Cruz. And I want to thank Ranking Member Blunt, the members of this committee, and especially you, Inspector General Bolton, not only for appearing before us today, but for all the work and recommendations that you've made. Your experience comes into play here in a big way. And I know some of these recommendations are being implemented as we speak, but there is much more to do. In today's hearing, we heard more about measures that are needed to restore trust and confidence in the U.S. Capitol Police leadership. These reforms are wide-ranging, impacting nearly all parts of the Capitol Police, including with respect to intelligence, training, equipment, and operational planning. As we have heard in today's hearing, it is clear that changes are needed and that they should be implemented without delay. It's why we got our report out as quickly as we could, and our bipartisan report makes a number of recommendations, several of which are discussed today. And you have made 65 recommendations yourself, Mr. Bolton, so far. While more must be done in the aftermath of the insurrection, and while I continue to feel very strongly that a 9/11 style report, an investigation on what happened on January 6th would be most helpful, because it would consolidate all the work that's being done across many branches of government, and including over in the House, because it would be bicameral. I still think it's really important that we implement these recommendations from our bipartisan report and your work